The scream of tearing metal cut through the ballroom before anyone understood what it meant. Elena Hartley froze near the tall glass doors, a tray of untouched wine glasses trembling in her hands, as the great chandelier above the Blackthorn Hall swung once, twice, and then crashed into 100 shards of light across the marble floor. Guards shouted. Wolves in human form shifted their weight, ready to become something else in an instant, and at the head of the room, rising slowly from his carved chair like a storm deciding whether to break, stood Alpha King Damien Cross. He did not flinch, he did not raise his voice. He simply lifted one hand, and the entire hall went still, as if his silence carried more weight than anyone else's shouting ever could. Elena had never been this close to him before. She was nobody in the Blackthorn pack, a low-ranking Omega assigned to serve drinks at a gathering meant to smooth relations between 3 rival territories. She was not supposed to be noticed. She was supposed to disappear into the wallpaper, fill glasses, and go home before midnight. But when Damien's dark eyes swept the room searching for the source of the attack, they landed on her, and for one unbearable second, they did not move away. "Get everyone to the East Wing," he said, and his voice, low and controlled, seemed to reach every corner of the hall without him raising it at all. Now, the attack, it turned out, had been a warning sent by the Draven Pack, a rival territory that had grown tired of Damien's refusal to renegotiate old hunting borders. A single explosive charge, planted beneath the chandelier rigging, had been meant to humiliate him in front of his allies. It had done exactly that. Elena watched from the corner of the East Wing, as council members whispered behind their hands, as visiting alphas exchanged glances that were not quite mocking but were not respectful either. She should have gone home. Instead, hours later, long after the guests had been escorted out and the guards had swept the grounds twice for further threats, she found herself alone in a quiet corridor, still holding a cloth she had used to clean glass from the floor, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You didn't run," Damien said. Elena turned, startled. He had changed out of his formal coat. His shirt was still creased from the tension of the evening, his jaw tight, in a way that made him look less like a king, and more like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. "I didn't think running would help," she said carefully. "Everyone else already had somewhere to run to. I didn't." Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't name. Not softness exactly, more like recognition, as if he had expected a frightened servant, and instead found someone who spoke to him without trembling. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know you well enough to be afraid of you," Elena answered. "I only know what people say." "And what do they say?" She hesitated. "That you're cold. That you care more about your borders than your own pack. That you've never once smiled during a council meeting." A ghost of something crossed his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Elena felt her pulse jump. "They're not wrong," he admitted. Most days. They talked longer than either of them intended, standing in that quiet corridor, while the rest of the estate settled into uneasy silence. Damien asked about her family, her work, the small house on the edge of the territory where she had grown up. Elena found herself surprised at how easily the conversation moved, how the distance between an Omega and an Alpha King seemed to shrink with every sentence. When he finally reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, she did not step back. That night, something happened between them that neither of them had planned. It was not calculated. It was not political. For a few hours, in the middle of a hall still smelling faintly of smoke from an explosion meant to break him, Damien Cross was simply a man, and Elena Hartley was simply a woman who had made him feel, for the first time in years, something other than calculation. She should have known it would not last. When she woke the next morning in an unfamiliar guest room, sunlight cutting harsh lines across the floor, Damien was already dressed, standing by the window with his back to her, his phone in hand as he spoke in clipped, businesslike tones to someone from his council. "Yes, tell the Draven envoy I expect a formal apology by the end of the week, or the border agreement is void," he was saying. He did not turn around. "No, I don't care what excuse they give. This is not a negotiation." Elena sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around herself, waiting for some acknowledgement, some flicker of the man who had spoken to her so gently hours before. When he finally ended the call and turned, His face had already rearranged itself into something unreadable, something distant. "You should go," he said, "before the staff start their morning rounds." "That's it?" Elena asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Damien's jaw tightened. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Something more than being told to leave before anyone sees me." He exhaled, and for a moment, something like guilt passed behind his eyes, quickly buried beneath the mask he wore for everyone. "Last night was last night," he said. "I have a pack to run. A war I'm trying to prevent. I don't have room for anything else. And I never pretended I did." The words landed like a slap, precise and cold. Elena gathered her clothes in silence, refusing to let him see how much the dismissal cut. As she reached the door, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Elena," she paused, foolishly hopeful for half a second. "Take the service exit," he said. "It's faster." She left without looking back. Weeks passed. Elena buried herself in work, telling herself the ache in her chest would fade, that she had known better than to expect anything from a man like Damien Cross. She avoided the parts of the territory where she might run into him, threw herself into extra shifts, and tried to convince herself that the night in that corridor had simply been a strange, isolated mistake. Then the sickness started. Small at first, a queasiness in the mornings she blamed on stress. Then the exhaustion, deep and unshakable, the kind that made her fall asleep in the middle of the afternoon. Her sense of smell sharpened until the scent of coffee alone made her stomach turn. It was her closest friend, Nora, a healer who worked in the Western Clinic, who finally sat her down and said the words Elena had been too afraid to think. "You're pregnant, Elena." The room seemed to tilt. Elena pressed a hand to her stomach, as if she could somehow undo the truth by touch alone. "That's not possible," she whispered, even as some deeper, instinctive part of her already knew it was. "It's very possible," Nora said gently. "And judging by the timeline you've given me, there's really only one person this could belong to." Elena's mind raced through every terrifying possibility. An Alpha King, learning that a nobody Omega carried his child, was not a fairy tale waiting to happen. It was a political disaster. Heirs born outside of sanctioned unions were used as leverage, as bargaining chips, as weapons in the endless games between packs. She had heard stories, whispered warnings passed between Omegas for generations, of children taken from their mothers the moment their bloodline was confirmed, raised by councils instead of parents, molded into tools rather than sons and daughters. And Damien, cold, calculating, consumed by his endless border wars, was exactly the kind of alpha who might see a child that way. An asset, proof of dominance, a pawn to secure his legacy, regardless of what it cost the woman who carried it. "You have to tell him," Nora said carefully, watching the fear bloom across Elena's face. "Elena, if he finds out on his own, later, it will be so much worse." "And if I tell him," Elena said, her voice shaking, "what happens to me? What happens to this baby, the moment it becomes useful to him?" Nora had no answer for that, neither of them did. That night, Elena stood at her window for hours, watching the lights of the Blackthorn estate glow faintly in the distance, and made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She would not wait to find out what kind of father Damien Cross would be. She would not risk her child becoming a piece on someone else's board. Before the sun rose again, she began quietly packing the few things she could carry without drawing attention, memorizing every excuse she might need to explain her disappearance, and preparing herself for a life on the run from the most powerful man in the territory. She did not yet know that fear alone would not be enough to keep her hidden forever. She did not know that 5 years from now, the same man who had once told her to take the service exit would tear apart everything he had built in order to find her again. All she knew, standing in the dark with one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, was that she had to disappear, completely and immediately, before anyone realized what she was carrying. By the time the first light touched the hills outside her window, Elena Hartley was already gone. Elena moved through the forest, with her heart pounding louder than her footsteps. Every snapped twig sounded like a warning. Every shift in the wind carried the fear that someone had already caught her scent. Nora had helped her prepare a mixture of crushed herbs, something the old healers used to mask a wolf's trail from trackers. But Elena had no way of knowing if it would be enough to hide her from an entire pack determined to protect their king's interests, should anyone ever learn what she carried. She had left in the hour before dawn, taking nothing but a small bag, a little money she had saved from years of careful work, and a folded photograph of her late mother, tucked into her coat pocket. The house she had grown up in, small and familiar, was behind her now, and she forced herself not to look back at it, afraid that if she did, she would lose the courage to keep walking. Nora met her at the edge of the territory border, waiting beside an old car with the engine already running. "You don't have to do this alone," Nora said, pressing a bag of supplies into Elena's hands. "You could stay. I could help you figure out how to tell him, how to protect yourself and the baby without running." "You know how these things go, Nora," Elena said quietly. "The moment a bloodline is confirmed, the council gets involved. It stops being about me, or him, or what either of us wants. It becomes about power. I won't let my child grow up as someone's political strategy." Nora's eyes were glassy, but she nodded, understanding even as it broke her heart. "Then let me at least help you get somewhere safe. I have a cousin outside Pack territory, in a town called Ashford Creek. Mixed community, mostly humans, a few wolves who left Pack life behind. No one there will ask questions about a woman traveling alone." The drive took most of the day, winding through unfamiliar roads that put more and more distance between Elena and everything she had ever known. She watched the landscape change outside the window, forests giving way to open fields, fields giving way to small towns with quiet main streets and modest houses, and tried to imagine herself building a life in a place like this, far from wolves and kings and the weight of a bloodline no one was supposed to know existed. When they finally arrived, Nora helped her rent a small apartment above a bakery, using a false name Elena had chosen on the drive, one with no connection to the Blackthorn Pack, or anything that might lead someone back to her. Elena Foster, she decided to call herself, a name plain enough to disappear into any crowd. "You'll need to be careful," Nora warned, helping her carry the last of her bags up the narrow stairwell. "Trackers can pick up traces of Pack scent, even years later if they get close enough. You should avoid other wolves as much as possible. Keep to yourself. And when the baby comes, you'll need someone who knows how to hide a child's scent too, at least until they're old enough to control their own shifting instincts." "I don't even know how to be a mother," Elena admitted, sitting down heavily on the edge of a narrow bed in the empty apartment. "Let alone a mother hiding from an alpha king." Nora sat beside her and took her hand. "You'll learn. Women have been doing impossible things for their children since the beginning of time. You are not the first Omega to run, Elena, and you won't be the last. But you might be one of the few who actually gets away." Before Nora left the next morning, promising to visit when she safely could, she gave Elena one final piece of advice. "Whatever you do, don't let anyone connect you to the Blackthorn Pack. Not through paperwork, not through old friends, not through habits that might give you away. And Elena, if you ever feel the baby's presence being sensed by another wolf, even a stranger, you leave immediately. Don't wait to find out why they're looking at you." The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of Elena's life. She learned the rhythms of Ashford Creek slowly, taking a job as a seamstress in a small shop near the town square, mending clothes for people who never asked more than her name and a fair price. She kept her head down, avoided the handful of wolves who occasionally passed through town, and spent her evenings alone in her small apartment, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her growing stomach, trying to imagine what kind of person this child would become. Some nights, despite everything, her mind wandered back to that corridor in the Blackthorn estate, to the brief hours when Damian Cross had looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than a servant filling wine glasses at a party, meant to distract from his enemies. She hated herself for the way her chest still ached when she remembered his voice, low and unguarded, asking about her family, her childhood, the small details of a life he had no business caring about. But then she remembered the coldness in his eyes the next morning, the clipped tone as he ended a call about border negotiations and told her to take the service exit before the staff arrived, and the ache turned into something closer to resolve. Whatever brief connection they had shared, it had not been enough to change who he was underneath it. A king first, a man second, if at all. Elena gave birth on a quiet spring morning, in a small clinic run by a midwife, who asked no questions about the father's absence. 2 babies arrived within minutes of each other, a boy and a girl, both with a shock of dark hair and a stillness in their newborn eyes that made the midwife pause and comment on how unusually alert they seemed, for infants only hours old. Elena named them Ethan and Lily, choosing names with no ties to pack tradition, nothing that might one day whisper their bloodline to anyone paying close attention. As she held them both for the first time, exhaustion and love crashing over her in equal measure, she made a silent promise that she would do whatever it took to keep them safe, even if it meant running for the rest of her life, even if it meant they never knew the truth about where they came from. She did not yet know that somewhere in Blackthorn territory, a betrayal was already taking shape, one that would eventually tear open the secret she had sacrificed everything to protect. 5 years passed in Ashford Creek, and with each one, Elena allowed herself to believe, just a little more, that she and her children were finally safe. The seamstress shop where she worked had become something close to a second home, its owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Doyle, treating Elena less like an employee and more like family. Ethan and Lily grew quickly, filling the small apartment above the bakery with noise and laughter that Elena had once feared she would never hear. They were unusual children, though Elena tried not to dwell too much on the ways they differed from the human kids they played with. Ethan could climb anything within reach by the time he was 3, moving with an agility that made other parents nervously grip their own children's hands a little tighter. Lily had an uncanny way of sensing moods before anyone spoke a word, tugging on Elena's sleeve moments before bad news arrived, or curling up beside her the instant sadness crept into the apartment. Elena watched them both carefully, teaching them early to control the flashes of instinct that occasionally slipped through, the way Ethan's eyes would sometimes catch the light strangely when he was upset, or the way Lily's hearing seemed sharper than any child's had a right to be. "You have to be careful," Elena told them gently one evening, kneeling in front of them after Ethan had nearly let his control slip in front of another family at the park, his fingers briefly curling into something that was not quite a hand. "The things that make you special, we have to keep those just between us. Can you do that for me?" Ethan, serious for a 5-year-old, nodded solemnly. "Because of the bad king," he said, repeating the phrase Elena had used more than once to explain, in the simplest terms she could manage, why they lived so carefully, why they never spoke of wolves or packs to anyone outside their small circle. "Because of the bad king," Elena agreed, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, though the words always left a strange taste in her mouth. She had never told her children who their father actually was, only that he was dangerous, that he ruled over people the way a storm rules over the sky, without care for who it might hurt along the way. It was not entirely fair to Damien, she sometimes admitted to herself in quiet moments, but fairness was a luxury she could not afford when her children's safety was at stake. Life in Ashford Creek settled into a rhythm that almost resembled peace. Elena saved carefully, built a small circle of trusted friends who never asked too many questions, and watched her twins grow into curious, clever children who filled her days with more joy than she had ever expected to feel again. Occasionally, in the quiet hours after they had gone to bed, she allowed herself to think about Damien, wondering if he had ever discovered the truth, wondering if some part of him regretted the morning he had told her to leave through the service exit. She did not know that 400 miles away, in the heart of Blackthorn territory, everything was beginning to unravel in ways that would eventually lead him straight to her door. The trouble began quietly, the way most serious betrayals do. Edmund Voss, a senior member of Damien's own council, had spent years cultivating secret alliances with rival packs, resentful of the strict control Damien exercised over border negotiations and trade routes. Edmund believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who had convinced himself of his own righteousness, that Damien's rigid leadership was slowly isolating Blackthorn from potential allies, weakening them in ways the young king refused to see. What began as backroom conversations and carefully worded compromises eventually grew into something far more dangerous. Edmund began sharing sensitive information with the Draven Pack, the same rivals responsible for the Chandelier attack years earlier, hoping to weaken Damien's position enough to force a change in leadership, believing he could manage the fallout and position himself as the reasonable alternative once the dust settled. He did not anticipate how quickly things would spiral beyond his control. One evening, deep within the Blackthorn record archives, a young clerk named Oliver Bennett stumbled upon something that would change everything. While cross-referencing old bloodline records for an unrelated council matter, Oliver noticed an anomaly buried in the Omega registry, a birth record filed under a false name that nonetheless carried unmistakable genetic markers linking directly back to the Blackthorn royal bloodline. The record had been quietly logged years earlier, by a clinic outside pack territory, required by law to report any births involving confirmed wolf lineage, even when the mother's identity had been deliberately obscured. Oliver, uncertain what he had found, but sensing its significance, brought the record to Edmund rather than directly to the king, following the chain of command he had always been taught to trust. It was, without question, the worst possible choice he could have made. Edmund stared at the document for a long time after Oliver left his office, his mind working through the implications, with the same cold calculation he applied to everything else. An unclaimed heir, a child, or possibly children, born to an unknown Omega who had clearly gone to extraordinary lengths to disappear. If Damien ever discovered this on his own, it would consume him entirely, distracting him from the political maneuvering Edmund had spent years carefully constructing. But if Edmund controlled the information instead, revealed it at precisely the right moment, he could use it to his advantage, forcing Damien into a position of vulnerability that Edmund could exploit for his own gain. He filed the discovery away, waiting for the right opportunity, unaware that his own betrayal was about to collide catastrophically with a truth far more personal and far more dangerous than he understood. Meanwhile, in Ashford Creek, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. A stranger had begun frequenting the town square, a man who claimed to be a traveling merchant, but whose eyes lingered too long on children playing near the fountain, whose posture carried the unmistakable stillness of someone trained to track. Elena kept Ethan and Lily close for days afterward, watching the stranger from a distance, cataloging every detail in case she needed to describe him later, to Nora, to anyone who might help her understand whether her worst fears were finally coming true. The stranger left town after a week, apparently satisfied with whatever he had been searching for, or perhaps simply moving on to another territory entirely. Elena told herself it meant nothing, that traveling merchants passed through small towns all the time, that she was letting years of fear make her see danger in every unfamiliar face. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong for several more months. The stranger had, in fact, been a low-level tracker employed by the Draven Pack, sent to investigate rumors that had begun circulating among rival territories about an Omega who had vanished from Blackthorn years earlier under suspicious circumstances, immediately after the Alpha King's disastrous night with a serving woman during a diplomatic gathering. The rumors were vague, second-hand, pieced together from careless comments and half-remembered gossip, but they were enough to make ambitious packs curious about what secrets Damien Cross might be hiding. Word eventually reached Edmund that rival packs had begun their own quiet search, hunting for the same unclaimed heir he had been sitting on for months, hoping to use the information as leverage against Damien at a moment of his choosing. Realizing he could no longer control the timeline, that others were closing in on a discovery that could either destroy him or elevate him, depending on how quickly he acted, Edmund made a decision that would ultimately expose his entire scheme. He arranged a private meeting with Damien, intending to present the birth record himself, carefully framed to suggest his own loyalty and discretion, hoping to position himself as the trusted advisor who had protected the king from a dangerous secret circulating among enemies. He did not anticipate how completely his plan would unravel the moment Damien actually saw the record with his own eyes. Back in Ashford Creek, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, Elena tucked Ethan and Lily into bed one ordinary evening, reading them a story about a fox who outsmarted a hunting party by staying perfectly still until the danger passed. She had chosen the story deliberately, the way she chose so many small things in their lives, hoping to teach her children the value of patience and caution, without ever explaining exactly why those lessons mattered so much. "Mama," Lily asked sleepily, just before drifting off, "will the bad king ever find us?" Elena smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead, forcing her voice to remain calm and steady. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're too careful for that. We're always going to be one step ahead." She believed it when she said it. She had no way of knowing that 400 miles away, in a private council chamber lit by flickering firelight, Damien Cross was staring down at a document that would send him tearing across the country in search of the family he had never known he had, driven by a fury and a longing so intertwined that even he could not tell where one ended and the other began. The firelight flickered across the council chamber walls as Damien read the document Edmund had placed in front of him, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the Alpha King went completely, utterly silent. Edmund had rehearsed this moment carefully, planning exactly how he would frame the discovery, how he would position himself as the loyal advisor protecting the king from dangerous rumors. But nothing in his rehearsal had prepared him for the way Damien's hands began to shake as he traced the birth record with one finger, the way his breath caught on a name he clearly recognized, despite the false surname attached to it. "Elena Hartley," Damien said quietly, and Edmund felt the first flicker of unease at how the king's voice cracked slightly on the name. "You know her?" Edmund asked, though he already suspected the answer, already understood he had badly misjudged the situation. Damien did not answer immediately. His mind was racing backward through the years, to a diplomatic gathering interrupted by an explosion, to a quiet corridor where a serving woman had spoken to him without fear, to a morning he had ended with cruel efficiency, because he had convinced himself that vulnerability was a weakness he could not afford as king. He remembered the way she had looked at him in that final moment before leaving, the flicker of hope in her eyes, replaced by something closer to heartbreak. He remembered telling her to take the service exit. "2 children," Damien said finally, reading further down the clinical notes attached to the birth record. "A boy and a girl." His voice had gone dangerously flat, the calm before a storm that Edmund, despite years of political maneuvering, suddenly realized he was completely unprepared for. "Born 5 years ago, which means she was already pregnant when she disappeared." "Your Majesty," Edmund began carefully, "I understand this is a shock, but I believe the most prudent course of action would be to handle this discreetly, through official channels, ensuring the bloodline is properly documented and secured before—" "You knew about this," Damien interrupted, looking up from the document for the first time, his dark eyes fixing on Edmund, with an intensity that made the older man's mouth go dry. "How long have you known?" Edmund's carefully constructed composure began to crack. "I only recently became aware." "How long, Edmund?" The silence stretched, damning in its length. Damien rose slowly from his chair, and though he had not shifted, though his hands remained human, there was something in the set of his shoulders, something in the low, controlled fury radiating from him, that made every instinct in Edmund's body scream to run. "Months," Edmund finally admitted. "I discovered it months ago. I was going to bring it to you. I simply wanted to be certain of the details first, to protect you from acting rashly on incomplete information." "You wanted to control the information," Damien said, his voice deadly quiet. "You wanted leverage. You've been sitting on the knowledge that I have children, that Elena has been alone somewhere for 5 years raising them without any support, without any protection, because it was useful to your own ambitions." Whatever excuse Edmund had prepared died in his throat. There was nothing he could say that would soften the truth of what Damien had already correctly deduced. Within the hour, Edmund was stripped of his council position, his access to pack resources revoked, his years of quiet betrayal laid bare before the entire leadership circle. It would take weeks for the full scope of his dealings with the Draven Pack to come to light, but in that single moment, Damien understood enough to know that trust within his own inner circle had been compromised at the deepest level. But Edmund's betrayal, as significant as it was, occupied only a fraction of Damien's attention that night. Alone in his private study hours later, the birth record spread across his desk, alongside every scrap of information his most trusted advisors could gather about Elena's disappearance. Damien felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Raw, unguarded panic. 5 years. His children had been alive for 5 years, and he had known nothing. Elena had carried them alone, given birth alone, raised them without a single resource he could have provided, all because he had been too consumed by his own political ambitions to see her as anything other than a temporary distraction the morning after. He thought of his own childhood, brief and complicated as it had been before his father's death, forced him into leadership far too young, and the memory of growing up without a parent who truly understood him settled like a stone in his chest. His children were growing up the same way, except worse, because at least Damien had known who his father was. Guilt was not an emotion Damien allowed himself often. It was inefficient, distracting, the kind of weakness that had gotten weaker alphas killed throughout history. But sitting alone with the proof of what his cruelty had cost, guilt arrived anyway, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Beneath the guilt, though, something else began to burn, something that felt disturbingly close to possession. These were his children, his bloodline, carrying the weight of generations of Blackthorn leadership. And somewhere out there, Beyond his reach, another pack's trackers were already searching for the same secret Edmund had tried to hide, meaning Elena and his children were not just missing. They were in danger, hunted by forces that would see them as nothing more than leverage or threats to be eliminated. The realization hardened something inside him that had been softening with guilt only moments before. He would find them. Whatever it took, whatever resources he needed to commit, whatever borders he needed to cross without permission, he would find Elena and the children she had hidden from him, and he would bring them home, where they belonged, where he could finally protect them, the way he should have protected Elena from the very beginning. He summoned his most trusted trackers before dawn, a small team led by a sharp-eyed enforcer named Callum Ashby, a man who had served the Blackthorn Pack loyally for over a decade, and had never once questioned an order from his king. "I want everything," Damien told them, spreading what little information they had across the war table in his private chamber. Every clinic within 500 miles that might have handled this birth record, every town where an Omega might disappear without drawing attention. I want her found before the Draven Pack gets anywhere close. "And if we find her, Your Majesty," Callum asked carefully, "what are your intentions?" Damien's jaw tightened, old habits of cold calculation, warring with something rawer, something he had spent 5 years refusing to acknowledge, even to himself. "My intentions," he said slowly, "are to bring my children home, and to make certain their mother never has reason to run from me again." He did not fully understand, standing in that war room as dawn broke over the Blackthorn estate, how much those two goals would eventually pull against each other, or how far he would have to travel, both across the country and within himself, before he could truly claim either one. Callum Ashby had tracked missing pack members before, runaway Omegas fleeing arranged bonds, young wolves testing the boundaries of their territory, before returning home chastened and exhausted. He had never tracked someone this carefully hidden, and he began to suspect, within the first week of the search, that whoever had helped Elena disappear had known exactly what they were doing. The clinic records led nowhere useful at first. Elena had given birth under a false name, and the small rural clinic that had processed the mandatory bloodline registration had long since closed its doors, its records scattered across a regional archive that took days to properly search. Callum's team fanned out across a wide radius, questioning healers, checking transportation records, following the thin, cold trail of a woman who had vanished 5 years earlier and left almost nothing behind. It was a breakthrough, from an unexpected source, that finally gave them their first real lead. A healer working in a clinic 2 towns over from Ashford Creek recognized a description Callum's team had been circulating, a woman matching Elena's general appearance who had once asked detailed questions about herbal scent masking techniques, questions that suggested more than casual curiosity. "She said it was for a friend," the healer told Callum's team, "but I remember thinking at the time that people don't usually ask that many specific questions about something meant for someone else." The healer could not provide a name, but she remembered enough details about the encounter, roughly when it happened, what Elena had been wearing, a small distinctive scar on her hand from an old kitchen accident, that Callum felt confident they were finally closing in on the right region. Meanwhile, Damien threw himself into the search with an intensity that alarmed even his most loyal advisors. He canceled diplomatic meetings that had taken months to arrange, delegated border negotiations to subordinates he would normally never trust with such sensitive matters, and spent his nights poring over maps and reports instead of sleeping. His council, still reeling from Edmund's exposed betrayal, watched their king transform before their eyes, from a controlled, calculating leader into something closer to a man consumed by obsession. You cannot run the entire territory from a war room dedicated to finding 1 Omega and 2 children. His second in command, a steady older wolf named Marcus Bellwether, warned him one evening. "Your enemies are watching, Damien. The moment they sense you're distracted, they will move against Blackthorn's interests." "Let them move," Damien said, not looking up from the map spread across his desk. "Nothing matters more right now than finding my children before the Draven Pack does." "And Elena?" Marcus asked carefully. "What happens to her once you find her?" Damien's hand stilled over the map. It was a question he had turned over in his mind constantly during the sleepless nights since Edmund's revelation, and he still did not have an answer that satisfied him. Part of him, the part shaped by years of political calculation, understood that Elena's disappearance had created a dangerous vulnerability, that bringing her and the children home under his direct protection was simply the necessary move to secure his bloodline. But another part of him, quieter and far more difficult to acknowledge, remembered the way she had looked at him in that corridor 5 years ago, unafraid and unguarded, in a way almost no one in his life had ever been. That part of him wanted something he had no vocabulary for, something beyond securing an heir, something that felt dangerously close to the ache he had spent years training himself not to feel. "I don't know yet," he admitted quietly, which was as close to honesty as he could manage, even with his most trusted advisor. The search intensified as Callum's team narrowed their focus toward the region surrounding Ashford Creek, following a trail of small, careful clues that Elena had never fully managed to erase. A shop owner, who remembered a quiet seamstress with 2 remarkably well-behaved children. A midwife's assistant who recalled unusual details about twin births 5 years earlier. Each small confirmation brought Damien's search team closer, and with every step, the danger to Elena and her children grew more acute, because Blackthorn trackers were not the only ones closing in. The rival Draven pack, having lost their own low-level scout months earlier without any useful information, had grown increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of the same secret. Their alpha, a ruthless and ambitious leader named Alaric Voss, understood the value of what he was searching for far better than his subordinates did. An unclaimed heir to the Blackthorn bloodline represented an extraordinary opportunity, whether used as a bargaining chip to force concessions from Damien, or, in the darkest calculations Alaric allowed himself to consider, eliminated entirely, to weaken Blackthorn's succession and destabilize their strongest rival. Alaric dispatched his own tracking team with instructions far less concerned with careful diplomacy than Damien's search efforts. Where Callum's team asked careful questions and followed subtle clues, Alaric's trackers moved with blunt urgency, willing to intimidate, threaten, and force information from anyone who might know something useful. It was this urgency that nearly exposed Elena weeks before Damien's team came anywhere close to finding her. One evening in Ashford Creek, as Elena walked home from the seamstress shop with Ethan and Lily trailing behind her, chattering about their day at school, she felt it before she consciously understood what was happening. A prickling awareness at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something far more dangerous than curious neighbors. She grabbed both children's hands without breaking stride, pulling them into a quickened pace that Ethan and Lily, trained through years of careful lessons, immediately understood to obey without question. They cut through an alley she had memorized months earlier, specifically for situations like this, emerging 2 streets over, near the back entrance of Margaret Doyle's shop, where Elena ushered the children inside and locked the door behind them with hands that would not stop shaking. "Mama, what's wrong?" Lily asked, her small face pale with the fear she had absorbed from her mother's sudden urgency. "Nothing, sweetheart," Elena lied, forcing calm into her voice, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Just being careful, like we practice." Margaret, alerted by the commotion, emerged from the back room with concern etched across her weathered face. "Elena, what's going on?" "I think someone's watching us," Elena admitted quietly, once the children were settled with coloring books far enough away not to hear the details of the conversation. "I felt it walking home. The same feeling I had years ago with that traveling merchant." Margaret's expression tightened. She had never asked too many questions about Elena's past, had simply accepted her as a hard-working young mother deserving of kindness, but she had always sensed there was more to Elena's careful habits than ordinary caution. "You need to leave," Margaret said simply. "Tonight, if you can manage it. I'll help however I need to." Elena spent that night packing with hands that trembled from adrenaline and exhaustion in equal measure, waking Ethan and Lily gently in the middle of the night and explaining, in the calm, practiced tone she had developed over years of preparing for exactly this moment, that they needed to move to a new town, that it was time for another adventure. They left Ashford Creek before dawn, Margaret providing what money and supplies she could spare, promising to cover their absence for as long as possible if anyone came asking questions. Elena did not know, as she drove through the darkness with her sleeping children in the back seat, whether the danger she had sensed belonged to Alaric's aggressive trackers or Damien's more careful search team. She only knew that 5 years of careful hiding had finally, inevitably, begun to unravel, and that whatever came next would be far more dangerous than anything she had faced since the night she first fled Blackthorn territory. Behind her, in Ashford Creek, both search teams would arrive within days of each other, each finding only the cold trail of a family that had vanished just hours before they could close in, each more determined than before to find them, wherever they went next. The new town, a quiet coastal community called Reed's Bay, felt different from Ashford Creek, in ways that unsettled Elena more than she wanted to admit. The salt air carried scents she couldn't fully identify, and the constant sound of waves against the shore made it harder to hear approaching footsteps the way she had grown accustomed to, in the stillness of her old apartment above the bakery. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, farther from neighbors than she would have liked, but private enough that Ethan and Lily could practice controlling their instincts, without fear of curious eyes catching something they shouldn't. She found work quickly, mending fishing nets and clothing for the local fleet, though the pay was less steady than her seamstress work had been, and she spent the first several weeks in Reed's Bay, in a constant state of watchfulness, jumping at unfamiliar sounds, memorizing exit routes from every building she entered. "You're always looking over your shoulder," Ethan observed one afternoon, with the unsettling perceptiveness that both her children seemed to possess. He was nearly 6 now, tall for his age, with an intensity in his dark eyes that reminded Elena, though she rarely let herself dwell on the resemblance, painfully of his father. "Are we still running from the bad king?" "We're just being careful," Elena said, the same practiced answer she had given 100 times before, though it felt increasingly hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, the near miss in Ashford Creek had shaken something loose in Elena that she couldn't quite settle back into place. For years, she had convinced herself that careful preparation and constant vigilance would be enough to keep her children safe indefinitely. But watching Margaret's frightened face as she helped them pack in the middle of the night, feeling that prickling certainty of being watched by something dangerous, had forced Elena to confront a truth she had avoided for a long time. She could not run forever. Eventually, either exhaustion or bad luck would catch up with her, and when it did, she needed her children prepared for whatever came next. She began teaching Ethan and Lily more directly about their heritage, careful lessons delivered in quiet moments, about controlling their instincts, about recognizing the subtle signs of another wolf's presence, about what to do if they were ever separated from her in a dangerous situation. It broke her heart to burden them with such heavy knowledge at such a young age, but she reasoned that ignorance would serve them far worse than preparation. "If anything ever happens to me," she told them one evening, kneeling in front of them with a seriousness that made both children go very still, "you go to Nora. You remember her address, the one I made you memorize?" Both children nodded solemnly. "Good," Elena said, pulling them both into a tight embrace. "But nothing is going to happen to me. I just want you to be prepared, the way we've always practiced." Despite her careful preparations, Elena could not have anticipated how quickly danger would find them again in Reed's Bay. It began innocently enough, with a new family moving into a house near the harbor, a father who introduced himself around town as a fisherman looking for steady work, though something about the way he carried himself, the careful stillness of a man used to controlling his own instincts, made Elena's skin prickle with unease, the very first time she saw him at the local market. She told herself it was paranoia, the lingering after-effects of the scare in Ashford Creek making her suspicious of every unfamiliar face. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger every time she encountered the fisherman around town, until one afternoon at the local school, she watched him linger near the fence during pickup time, his eyes tracking children with an intensity that had nothing to do with ordinary parental interest. Her heart nearly stopped when she realized his gaze had settled directly on Ethan. Elena moved quickly, gathering both children and steering them away from the school grounds with a forced casualness that took every ounce of self-control she possessed. She did not run, understanding instinctively that running would confirm whatever suspicion had drawn his attention in the first place, but she kept her pace brisk, her hand tight around each of her children's wrists, until they were safely inside their cottage, with the door locked behind them. That night, unable to shake the certainty that they had been found, Elena packed again, her hands moving through the familiar motions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. But this time, exhaustion pressed down on her differently, heavier than before, carrying the weight of 5 years spent constantly moving, constantly watching, constantly afraid. "Mama," Lily said quietly, watching her mother pack from the doorway of her small bedroom, "are we ever going to stop running?" The question hit Elena harder than she expected, and for a moment, she simply stood frozen with a folded shirt in her hands, unable to answer honestly. "I don't know, baby," she finally admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I hope so. I hope one day we can just live somewhere and be happy, without always looking over our shoulders." "Do you think the bad king is looking for us because he wants to hurt us?" Ethan asked, appearing beside his sister with the same serious expression that so often made him seem older than his years. "Or because he wants to find us?" Elena hesitated, struck by the simplicity and depth of her son's question, a question she herself had never fully allowed herself to examine. She thought of Damien, in that quiet corridor 5 years ago, the unguarded way he had spoken to her before politics and duty reasserted themselves the next morning. She thought of the coldness in his voice as he told her to take the service exit, and the flicker of something else, something that might have been genuine feeling, buried beneath years of careful control. "I don't know that either," she admitted quietly. "But it doesn't matter right now. What matters is keeping you both safe until we understand more." They left Reed's Bay before sunrise, driving inland this time, away from the coast and toward a small mountain town Nora had once mentioned as a possible refuge if things ever became too dangerous elsewhere. Elena drove for hours, exhaustion and fear warring for dominance in her mind, glancing constantly at the rearview mirror, as if expecting headlights to appear behind her at any moment. They did not appear, not that day, but Elena knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that their time was running out. Whoever had been watching them in Reed's Bay, whether connected to Damien's search or the more dangerous rival pack she had always feared, had come close enough to force them into flight twice within a matter of weeks. The careful, controlled life she had built for her children was crumbling faster than she could rebuild it, and somewhere deep inside, buried beneath years of fear and determination, a small, exhausted part of Elena began to wonder if running was truly the only way to keep her children safe, or if it had simply become the only thing she knew how to do. She did not yet know that the fisherman in Reed's Bay had, in fact, belonged to neither search team, an unrelated wolf who had simply relocated his own family and happened to watch children at the school fence out of harmless curiosity about a new town's residents. The near miss that sent Elena fleeing once again had been nothing more than her own frayed nerves finally catching up with 5 years of relentless vigilance. But the real danger, the one she had correctly sensed lurking somewhere behind her for months, was closer than she realized, and it would not be mistaken identity the next time her instincts screamed at her to run. The mountain town of Millstone Ridge sat nestled between 2 steep ridgelines, far enough from any major road that Elena had hoped its isolation alone would buy her time to think, to plan, to figure out what came next after months of narrowly escaping danger that seemed to grow closer with every passing week. She rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, and spent the first few days simply trying to help Ethan and Lily adjust to yet another unfamiliar place, another new set of rules about which parts of themselves they needed to hide. She did not know that Callum Ashby's team had finally connected the scattered pieces of her trail, following reports of a woman matching her description who had passed through Reed's Bay only weeks earlier, then tracing rental records and cash transactions with a patience and thoroughness that Elena, exhausted from months of constant flight, had begun to underestimate. It was late afternoon, the mountain light turning gold across the pines outside her cabin, when Elena heard the crunch of tires on gravel that did not belong to any vehicle she recognized. Her entire body went rigid with instinctive alarm, and she called Ethan and Lily inside from the small yard where they had been playing, her mind already racing through escape routes she had memorized the moment they arrived in town. But when she looked through the window and saw who stepped out of the vehicle, every escape plan she had ever made evaporated instantly, replaced by a shock so profound it momentarily stole her ability to think at all. Damien Cross stood in her driveway, 5 years older than the last time she had seen him, his dark hair slightly longer, deep lines of exhaustion carved beneath his eyes that had not been there before. He wore simple clothes instead of the formal attire she remembered, but there was no mistaking him, no mistaking the way his presence seemed to fill the entire yard, even from a distance, the same commanding stillness that had first caught her attention in a corridor 5 years ago. Behind him, Callum and two other trackers hung back respectfully, clearly understanding this was a moment that belonged to their king alone. Elena's first instinct was to run, to gather her children and disappear through the back door before Damien even reached the porch. But something in his expression, some raw vulnerability she had never expected to see on the Alpha King's face, made her freeze in place, torn between 5 years of careful survival instincts and something else entirely, something she had spent years trying to convince herself she no longer felt. Elena. Elena. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the cold control she remembered from that final morning in the Blackthorn estate. It cracked slightly on her name, raw and uncertain in a way that made her chest ache despite everything. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she wanted it to carry. "I know," Damien admitted, taking a slow step closer, his hands raised slightly, as if approaching something wild and easily frightened. "I know I have no right to be here after everything, but Elena, I know about the children. I know they're mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 5 years of secrets and fear, and everything left unsaid. Behind Elena, she heard the small shuffle of footsteps, as Ethan and Lily crept closer to the window, curiosity overriding the caution she had spent years drilling into them. "How did you find us?" Elena asked, though the question felt almost beside the point, now that the moment she had feared for 5 years had finally arrived. "Edmund," Damien said, "one of my council members discovered a birth record months ago and tried to use it against me. I've been searching for you ever since. Elena, I need you to understand, I never knew. If I had known you were pregnant when you left, I would never have let you disappear." "And what would you have done instead?" Elena asked, old anger surfacing despite the shock still coursing through her. "Kept me somewhere convenient until the child was born, then decided what use I still served afterward. You made it very clear, that morning, exactly how much I mattered to you." Damien's jaw tightened, but he did not look away from her, did not retreat into the cold defensiveness she half expected. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I was a coward that morning, Elena. I was terrified of what I felt after one night with you. Terrified enough that I convinced myself the only safe response was cruelty. It doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses it. But I have spent 5 years telling myself that morning didn't matter, and finding out about our children has forced me to admit I was lying to myself the entire time." Behind Elena, the front door creaked open slightly, and Ethan's voice, small but steady, cut through the tension. "Mama, is that the Bad King?" Damien's entire expression shifted, the careful composure he had maintained, cracking entirely, as his eyes fell on the small boy standing in the doorway. Dark hair, and serious eyes, so unmistakably a reflection of his own, that any lingering doubt Damien might have carried about the birth record's accuracy disappeared instantly. "Ethan," Elena said softly, torn between protecting her son and understanding that the moment for full honesty had finally, unavoidably arrived. "This is your father." Ethan studied Damien with the same unnerving seriousness that had always made him seem older than his years, and beside him, Lily appeared in the doorway as well, peering out with wide, curious eyes at the stranger who had traveled so far to find them. Damien knelt slowly, bringing himself down to their level, his voice gentler than Elena had ever heard it. "Hello," he said simply. "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to meet you both." "Are you going to take us away from Mama?" Lily asked, with the blunt directness only a small child could manage, and Elena watched something painful flicker across Damien's face at the question. "No," Damien said, though Elena could hear the effort it took him to make the promise without qualification, without the political calculation that had always governed his decisions before. "I'm not here to take you anywhere you don't want to go. I just want to know you. All 3 of you, if you'll let me." The conversation that followed stretched long into the evening, careful and halting at first, then gradually more open, as Elena allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that Damien's transformation might be genuine, rather than another calculated maneuver. He told her about Edmund's betrayal, about the months spent searching with an intensity that had alarmed his entire council, about the guilt that had kept him awake most nights since learning the truth. "I still intend to bring you home," he admitted eventually, once Ethan and Lily had been coaxed to bed by Elena, the 2 adults sitting across from each other at the small kitchen table with cups of tea neither had touched. "Blackthorn territory has resources, Protection. An entire pack, capable of keeping you and the children safe, in ways I don't think you can manage alone anymore. Rival packs are searching for them too, Elena. The Draven pack has been hunting the same information Edmund discovered, and they are not interested in your children's welfare the way I am. And if I refuse, Elena said carefully, if I decide Blackthorn territory is exactly the kind of political danger I've spent 5 years trying to protect my children from. Damien's expression grew serious, weighing his words with more care than she remembered him ever exercising during their brief time together years ago. Then I would ask you to at least let me prove, over time, that I'm not the man who told you to leave through a service exit. I won't force you home against your will, Elena, but I'm asking you to give me the chance to be something better than the father I've been for the first 5 years of their lives, even if that chance takes time to earn. Elena studied him across the small table, searching his face for any trace of the cold calculation she remembered, and finding instead something that looked disturbingly like sincerity, wrapped in the exhaustion of a man who had clearly spent months confronting mistakes he had never allowed himself to examine before. I need time, she finally said, not to run from you again, just time to think, to talk to the children, to figure out what any of this actually means for our lives. Damien nodded slowly, and though she could see how much restraint it cost him to accept anything less than immediate resolution, he did not push further that night. Take whatever time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere, Elena, not this time. Outside, unseen by either of them in the gathering darkness of the mountain evening, one of Callum's trackers had noticed something troubling in the tree line beyond the cabin's small clearing, a scent that did not belong to any member of their own search party, sharp and unfamiliar, and carrying the unmistakable signature of a rival pack's markings. The danger Elena had sensed for months, the one that had sent her fleeing from town after town, had finally caught up to them all, arriving at the exact moment when the fragile beginning of something like trust was starting to take shape between two people who had spent 5 years running from each other in entirely different ways. Callum found Damien just after midnight, still sitting on the small porch of Elena's cabin, unwilling to leave despite Elena having gone inside hours earlier to check on the children. The tracker's expression carried a gravity that made Damien rise immediately from his chair. We found a scent marking in the tree line, Callum said quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough not to carry through the cabin's thin walls. Draven pack markings, less than a day old. They know she's here, or they're close enough to finding out that it won't matter much longer. Damien's blood ran cold. How many? Impossible to say for certain, at least 2, possibly more scouting the perimeter, before committing to anything larger. Your Majesty, I recommend we move Elena and the children immediately, tonight, before whoever left that marking returns with reinforcements. Damien glanced back at the cabin, at the warm light glowing faintly behind curtained windows where Elena had finally, cautiously, agreed to let him back into her life after 5 years of separation. Moving them now, without warning, felt like exactly the kind of unilateral decision that had cost him her trust in the first place. But the alternative, waiting until morning while a rival pack's scouts potentially returned with enough numbers to overwhelm his small tracking team, was not a risk he was willing to take with his children's safety. He knocked softly on the cabin door, and Elena answered, still dressed, clearly unable to sleep despite the late hour, her face immediately alert to the tension radiating from him. What's wrong? She said, not a question but a statement, years of instinctive caution, reading his expression accurately before he even spoke. Draven scouts, Damien said quietly, close enough that Callum found their markings in the tree line tonight. I know I promised you time, Elena, and I know moving suddenly is exactly the kind of thing that makes you distrust me. But I need you to trust me on this one decision, tonight, because the alternative puts Ethan and Lily in direct danger. Elena's face paled, but she did not hesitate the way Damien had half expected. 5 years of constant vigilance had trained her to move quickly at the first sign of real threat, and within 20 minutes, both children were awake and dressed, gathered into one of Damien's secured vehicles, alongside a small bag of essentials Elena had learned to keep permanently packed for exactly this kind of emergency. They drove through the night toward a secured Blackthorn safe house 2 hours away, a modest property Damien's advisors maintained, specifically for situations requiring discretion and protection outside the main territory. Ethan and Lily slept fitfully in the back seat, exhausted by the sudden disruption, while Elena sat rigid beside Damien in the front, watching the dark road ahead with the same wary alertness she had carried for 5 years. "You didn't have to come with us tonight," Elena said quietly, somewhere in the second hour of driving, when the silence between them had stretched long enough to feel unbearable. "You could have sent Callum's team to handle the relocation." "I wasn't going to let anyone else handle this," Damien said simply. "Not after everything I've already failed to protect you both from." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the headlights carve through the darkness. "Tell me something," she finally said. "Why were you so cold that morning, 5 years ago?" "I've spent years trying to understand it, and I still don't fully believe the explanation you gave me back at the cabin." Damien's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness that surprised her. "My father died when I was 19, he said. "Killed during a border dispute that should never have escalated as far as it did. I became Alpha King overnight, completely unprepared, surrounded by advisors who all had their own agendas, and very little patience for a grieving teenager, trying to figure out how to lead an entire territory." He paused, gathering the words with visible difficulty. "I learned very quickly that showing vulnerability got you exploited. Every soft moment, every hesitation, every sign that I cared about something more than strategic advantage, became a weakness that someone tried to use against me. So I built walls, Elena, very high, very cold walls, and I convinced myself that was the only way to survive as king. And then you met me," Elena said quietly. "And then I met you," Damien agreed. "And for one night, I forgot every wall I had ever built. It terrified me more than any political threat I had ever faced. So the next morning, I did what I always did when something threatened to make me vulnerable. I destroyed it before it could destroy me." Elena absorbed this in silence, feeling something complicated shift inside her chest, sympathy warring with the lingering hurt of 5 years spent believing she had simply been a temporary distraction for a cruel and calculating king. "That doesn't excuse how you treated me," she finally said. "No," Damien agreed immediately. "It doesn't. I'm not asking you to excuse it, Elena. I'm asking you to understand it, so that you can decide whether the man who built those walls is capable of tearing them down, for good, for our children, and maybe, if you'll allow it, for you as well." They arrived at the safe house just before dawn, a modest but well-secured property nestled deep within a forested valley, surrounded by a discreet perimeter of blackthorn guards who had been quietly stationed there within hours of Damien's call. Ethan and Lily, groggy but curious, explored the unfamiliar house with cautious interest, while Elena finally allowed herself to sit down, exhaustion catching up to her all at once, as the adrenaline of the sudden relocation began to fade. "You should rest," Damien said gently, watching her from across the small living room. "You're safe here, Elena. This location isn't in any records, isn't connected to Blackthorn territory through anything that could be traced back through official channels." "I don't know how to just rest," Elena admitted, a bitter, exhausted laugh escaping her. "I've spent 5 years never fully relaxing, always half expecting something to force us to run again." Damien moved closer, settling into the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the genuine concern etched into his features. "Then let me watch over things tonight," he said. "Just for a few hours. Let yourself actually sleep, Elena. I promise you, nothing is getting past the guards outside without me knowing immediately." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena allowed herself to trust someone else with the exhausting weight of vigilance she had carried alone for years. She fell asleep on the small couch within minutes, and when she woke hours later to the sound of Ethan and Lily's quiet laughter, she found Damien sitting on the floor between them, patiently helping Lily construct something from a small pile of building blocks the safe house kept stocked for occasional child visitors, his expression soft in a way Elena had never witnessed before, not even during their brief hours together 5 years ago. Watching him with their children, some small, cautious part of Elena's guarded heart began to wonder, for the first time since fleeing Blackthorn territory, whether the life she had spent 5 years running from might actually be worth walking back toward. But even as that fragile hope began to take root, deep in the forest surrounding the safe house, Draven scouts were already regrouping, having lost the trail at Millstone Ridge but picking up fresh signs of activity along the road leading toward the valley. closing in once again on a family that had allowed themselves, however briefly, to believe they might finally be safe. The attack came just after nightfall, 3 days into their stay at the safe house, when the guards patrolling the outer perimeter first noticed unfamiliar movement along the tree line to the north. Alaric Voss himself had traveled with this particular scouting party, having grown impatient with weeks of near misses, and determined to personally oversee the capture of whatever leverage the Blackthorn heirs might provide against his oldest rival. Damien had been reviewing security reports with Callum in the small study when the first alert came through. A guard's urgent voice crackling over the radio reporting movement along the northern fence line, too coordinated and too numerous to be wildlife or a false alarm. "Get Elena and the children into the safe room," Damien ordered immediately, already moving toward the door, every instinct sharpening into the focused calm that had once made him such an effective leader before 5 years of guilt and searching had worn away at his composure. "Callum, seal the perimeter and get every available guard positioned around the house." Elena appeared in the hallway, alarm evident on her face, as she took in the sudden urgency radiating from everyone around her. "What's happening?" "Draven scouts," Damien said, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "I need you to take Ethan and Lily to the safe room downstairs. Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone except me or Callum. Understood?" "I'm not hiding while you're out there facing them alone," Elena said, old instincts flaring even through her fear. "You're not hiding," Damien corrected. "You're protecting our children, which is exactly what needs to happen right now. Elena, please. I need to know you're all safe, so I can focus on making sure this ends quickly." Something in his eyes, a plea rather than a command, finally convinced her, and she gathered Ethan and Lily, both wide-eyed with fear they were trying hard to control, and disappeared toward the reinforced safe room, built into the house's foundation, specifically for situations exactly like this one. Outside, the confrontation began quickly and without warning, Draven scouts pressing forward from multiple directions in a coordinated attempt to overwhelm the smaller Blackthorn security detail before reinforcements could arrive. Damien moved among his guards with practiced authority, directing their defense with the same strategic precision he applied to political negotiations, refusing to let panic override the careful positioning that gave them their best chance of holding the perimeter. Alaric Voss himself emerged from the tree line partway through the confrontation, confident in his numbers, and eager to claim the victory personally, rather than delegate it to subordinates. "Cross," Alaric called out, his voice carrying easily across the tense standoff that had settled between the two groups. "I only want the children. Hand them over peacefully, and everyone here walks away tonight." "You know I can't do that," Damien answered, positioning himself deliberately between Alaric's line of sight and the house behind him. "Turn your people around now, Alaric, before this becomes something you can't walk back from." "You've spent 5 years hiding an heir from your own council," Alaric said, a cold smile playing at his mouth. "Do you really think I'm going to walk away empty-handed after finally tracking them down?" The standoff broke into sudden motion as several of Alaric's scouts attempted to circle around toward the house's side entrance, forcing Damien's guards into a scrambling defense that stretched their smaller numbers dangerously thin. Damien found himself directly confronting one of the largest scouts, a confrontation that tested every ounce of strength and control he possessed, both combatants determined not to yield ground that would expose the house behind them. Inside the safe room, Elena held Ethan and Lily close, both children trembling despite their training, listening to the muffled sounds of confrontation happening somewhere above and around them. Lily buried her face against Elena's shoulder, while Ethan, despite his fear, kept glancing toward the sealed door with an expression that suggested a growing, dangerous impulse to help somehow. "Stay here," Elena said firmly, recognizing the look immediately. "No matter what you hear, Ethan, you stay in this room with your sister until your father or Callum comes to get us. Do you understand me?" Ethan nodded reluctantly, though the tension in his small shoulders suggested how much restraint the promise required. Above them, the confrontation had begun to shift dangerously, as Alaric's numbers slowly pressed Damien's smaller detail back toward the house itself. Callum fought alongside his king with fierce loyalty, but even his considerable skill could not fully compensate for being significantly outnumbered, and Damien felt, with mounting alarm, their defensive line beginning to buckle under sustained pressure. It was Elena, watching through a small reinforced window in the safe room, and recognizing the growing desperation in the guard's positioning, who made the decision that ultimately changed the course of the confrontation. She had spent 5 years learning to protect her children, through careful avoidance, through running and hiding and disappearing, before danger could ever reach them directly. But watching Damien's small team struggle against overwhelming numbers, she understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that hiding was no longer an option that would keep anyone safe tonight. "Stay here," she told Ethan and Lily, pressing a firm kiss to each of their foreheads despite their protests. "I mean it. Don't move from this room." She emerged from the safe room and made her way toward the study, where she knew Damien kept emergency communication equipment, and used it to alert the wider network of Blackthorn guards stationed at checkpoints throughout the surrounding region, providing exact coordinates and details that brought a second wave of reinforcements racing toward the safe house at speeds that would arrive within critical minutes, rather than the longer time frame Alaric's scouts had likely calculated when planning their approach. Then, drawing on instincts she had suppressed for years, careful never to reveal the full extent of her own wolf nature, in front of curious neighbors or watchful strangers, Elena shifted for the first time in longer than she could remember, emerging from the house to join the confrontation directly, moving with a speed and precision that startled even Damien when he caught sight of her fighting alongside his remaining guards. "Elena, get back inside," Damien shouted, alarm evident, even amid the chaos of the ongoing confrontation. "I told you I wasn't going to hide while you faced this alone," Elena called back, positioning herself to cover a gap in their defensive line that had been dangerously exposed only moments before. Fighting side by side for the first time, something shifted between them beyond mere strategic necessity, a wordless understanding passing between two people who had spent 5 years apart finally, undeniably, functioning as a unified team. The reinforcements Elena had summoned arrived within minutes, overwhelming Alaric's numbers, and forcing a hasty, disorganized retreat that left the Draven Alpha himself narrowly escaping capture, his ambitions for tonight's confrontation thoroughly, decisively defeated. In the exhausted aftermath, as Blackthorn guards secured the perimeter and confirmed the immediate threat had passed, Damien found Elena standing near the tree line, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing visibly through her frame. "You could have been killed," he said, equal parts relief and lingering fear roughening his voice. "So could you," Elena answered. "I wasn't going to let that happen while I hid in a safe room, Damien. Not when I could actually help." He crossed the distance between them and, without fully deciding to do so, pulled her into an embrace that carried 5 years of longing and guilt and everything neither of them had allowed themselves to say since her sudden reappearance in his life. Elena tensed for a moment, old instincts warring with the overwhelming relief of the confrontation finally ending, before she allowed herself to lean into him, exhaustion and adrenaline giving way to something softer, something that felt disturbingly like the beginning of forgiveness. "I was so afraid of losing you both again," Damien admitted quietly against her hair. "Tonight made me realize how much I've been afraid of that, since the moment I learned you existed with our children, hidden somewhere I couldn't reach." "I was afraid too," Elena admitted, "every single day for 5 years. But tonight, fighting beside you, I understood something I've been trying not to admit since you found us at that cabin." "What's that?" Damien asked softly. "That some part of me never stopped caring what happened to you," Elena said, "even after everything that hurt so badly between us. I think that's why I've been so afraid this whole time, Damien. Not just of losing our children's safety, but of losing whatever this is, again, before I even let myself understand what it means." Inside the house, safely tucked in the reinforced room where their parents had insisted they remain, Ethan and Lily finally emerged once Callum confirmed it was safe, running toward the sound of their parents' voices and finding them standing together near the tree line, closer than either child had seen them stand before, something unspoken, but unmistakable finally settling into place between two people who had spent 5 years running from very different kinds of fear. The weeks following the confrontation at the safe house brought changes neither Elena nor Damien could have fully anticipated, though both understood, with growing certainty, that the life they had once imagined separately was beginning to merge into something neither had dared hope for during the long years apart. Damien's counsel, still adjusting to the fallout from Edmund's exposed betrayal, received the news of the confirmed heirs with a mixture of relief and cautious curiosity. Marcus Bellwether, ever the pragmatic advisor, called an emergency session within days of the family's return to Blackthorn territory. Understanding that formal acknowledgement of Ethan and Lily's bloodline needed to happen carefully, deliberately, in a way that protected them from the same political exploitation that had driven Elena to flee in the first place. The council will want reassurances, Marcus warned Damien privately, before the formal session began. Some will question why an unclaimed heir was kept secret for 5 years. Others will worry about legitimacy, about succession, about what this means for existing alliances and agreements. Then I'll answer every question honestly, Damien said, standing straighter than Marcus had seen him stand in months. I'm done hiding behind careful political calculation when it comes to my own family, Marcus. Elena and our children deserve better than being treated as a problem to be managed. The council session that followed tested Damien's resolve more thoroughly than he expected. Council members raising pointed questions about Elena's background, about the circumstances of her disappearance, about whether an Omega with no formal political standing could adequately represent Blackthorn interests, should she remain permanently within the pack's leadership structure. It was Elena herself, unexpectedly, who addressed the room's lingering doubts most effectively, standing before the assembled council with a steadiness that surprised even Damien. I ran because I was afraid my children would be treated exactly the way some of you are treating this conversation right now, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. As assets, as political calculations, as problems requiring careful management, rather than as children deserving safety and love. I am not asking any of you to forget the circumstances that led to this moment. I am asking you to look at Ethan and Lily, to understand that whatever their bloodline means politically, they are, first and foremost, 2 children who deserve a chance to grow up knowing both their parents, protected, rather than exploited, by the power they were born into. The room fell silent, several council members visibly reassessing their earlier skepticism in the face of her directness. Marcus, watching from beside Damien, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, recognizing in Elena's steady confidence exactly the kind of strength that would serve Blackthorn territory well in the years ahead. Edmund's fate, meanwhile, had already been settled in the weeks prior. His ties to the Draven Pack's aggressive pursuit of the Blackthorn heirs, thoroughly exposed once Alaric's failed attack at the safe house, forced a full investigation into how the rival pack had obtained their information. Edmund was formally exiled from Blackthorn territory, stripped of every title and privilege he had spent decades accumulating, his ambitions ultimately costing him far more than the influence he had hoped to gain by controlling Elena's secret. Alaric Voss, having narrowly escaped capture during the confrontation, found his own position significantly weakened among his allies, once word spread of his failed attempt to seize Blackthorn's heirs through direct aggression. Several of his own pack's senior members, uncomfortable with the reckless risk Alaric had taken pursuing children rather than pursuing legitimate political advantage, began quietly distancing themselves from his leadership, leaving the Draven Pack considerably less capable of threatening Blackthorn interests in the near future. With the immediate dangers addressed and the council's formal acknowledgement secured, Damien turned his attention toward the promise he had made to Elena in that small mountain cabin, the promise to prove, over time, that he had truly become someone worthy of the trust she had once given him, so freely, and lost so completely. He did not rush the process, understanding instinctively that 5 years of hurt could not be resolved through grand gestures alone. Instead, he showed up consistently, learning the small details of his children's daily lives, attending Ethan's first attempts at controlled shifting exercises, sitting patiently through Lily's elaborate imaginary games, gradually earning the kind of easy trust from his children that came naturally to patient, present parents. With Elena, the process moved more slowly, built through quiet conversations late in the evening after the children had gone to sleep, through small acts of consideration that gradually chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart during 5 years of solitary survival. Damien never pushed for more than she was ready to give, understanding that the trust he had broken so carelessly years ago required patient rebuilding rather than demanded restoration. It was nearly 6 months after their reunion, on a quiet evening when autumn had begun turning the leaves across Blackthorn territory gold and crimson, that Damien finally found the courage to say the words he had been carrying since the confrontation at the safe house. "I love you," he told Elena, standing on the same balcony where, years earlier, an explosion had first interrupted a diplomatic gathering, and set their entire complicated history into motion. I think some part of me has loved you since that first night in the corridor, Elena, even though I was too afraid and too foolish to admit it when it might have made a difference. I'm asking you now, not as your king, but simply as Damien, whether you might consider building a life together, properly, as partners, rather than as two people brought together only by circumstance. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it so many times over the past 6 months, looking for any trace of the coldness that had once driven her to flee everything she knew. She found none, only the steady, patient sincerity of a man who had spent months proving, through consistent action rather than empty words, that he had genuinely changed. "I love you too," she finally said, the words carrying the weight of a burden she had carried alone for far too long finally being set down. "I think I never fully stopped, even during the years I spent trying to convince myself otherwise." Their formal claiming ceremony took place the following spring, a celebration that drew Blackthorn pack members from across the territory, along with cautious well-wishes from neighboring packs eager to see stability restored to a territory that had weathered significant turmoil over the preceding year. Ethan and Lily, now old enough to fully understand the significance of the occasion, stood proudly beside their parents, as Damien formally acknowledged them before the assembled pack, securing their place as legitimate heirs to the Blackthorn bloodline, protected now, not by secrecy and constant flight, but by the full strength and support of the territory their father ruled. Nora and Margaret Doyle both traveled considerable distances to attend, standing together near the front of the gathered crowd, both women reflecting quietly on the frightened, exhausted young mother they had each helped along her long journey toward this unexpected, hard-won happiness. Standing together as the ceremony concluded, watching Ethan and Lily laugh and play among pack children who would grow up alongside them, rather than in the isolated secrecy Elena had once believed was their only option for safety, Damien turned to Elena with an expression she had never seen him wear during their earliest days together, something unguarded and completely at peace. "5 years ago," he said quietly, "I told you to leave through a service exit because I was too afraid to admit what I actually felt. I spent 5 years believing that fear had cost me everything that mattered most. And now?" Elena asked, smiling, despite the bittersweet memory his words carried. "Now I understand that sometimes the things we run from hardest are exactly the things we need most," Damien said, drawing her close as the autumn sun set gold across Blackthorn territory. "I'm never going to let either of you run from me again, Elena. Not because I intend to control you, but because I finally understand what it means to fight for something worth keeping, rather than pushing it away out of fear." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, watching their children play in the golden evening light, finally, completely at peace with a life she had once believed impossible. The cruel Alpha King she had fled 5 years earlier had transformed, through patience, honesty, and genuine effort, into exactly the kind of father and partner she had once feared she would never find, proving that even the coldest walls could be dismantled when someone finally found the courage to choose vulnerability over fear. Their story, one that began with a single reckless night and years of desperate flight, ended not with the cruelty that had once defined it, but with a hard-won devotion strong enough to protect everything that truly mattered, for Ethan and Lily, for Blackthorn territory, and for two people who had finally found their way back to each other, after everything that had once seemed determined to keep them apart.